Well, I think the appropriate thing to say at this point is, howdy, Aggies. Howdy. You know, when I arrived here, I thought this word Aggie is an interesting word. And I thought I would search my mind etymologically to find out what it meant. And I came to the solution very quickly. Because, of course, the plural of the Greek word hagios is agioi. So it obviously comes from agioi, which means the holy ones. So I'm delighted to be among the holy ones. And actually, I did yesterday attempt to understand the Super Bowl. Now, I've tried before. I once watched the Kansas City Chiefs, and sitting beside me was a huge, great man whose name was up in the Hall of Fame. They decided I needed tremendous help to understand this game, so they sent me one of the top men. And after an hour, he leant over to me and he said, "Do you understand it now?" Oh, I said, "Perfectly." He said, "What is American football?" Well, I said, as far as I can see, it's a series of prayer meetings interrupted by war. I didn't understand anything yesterday, so I gave up. But it's lovely to be at your famous university, which echoes around the world. And what a spectacular campus you've got. You're a very fortunate lot to be able to study at an institution like this. And it's so lovely to see so many of you. And of course, as usual, I've been set an impossible subject to deal with in a relatively short time. So what I'm going to do is raise certain ideas. I hope you'll be thinking and writing questions, and we'll see how we get on. The question set to me was, is belief in the supernatural irrational? And in that title, there are four substantive ideas: belief, supernatural, irrational, and the word miracle. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary describes a miracle as a marvelous event occurring within human experience which cannot have been brought about by human power or by the operation of any natural agency, and must therefore be ascribed to the special intervention of the deity or of some supernatural being. The idea that the supernatural exists is very contrary to the dominant worldview in the academy in the West today, which is naturalism. And I suppose Julian Huxley put it very well when he said the idea of miraculous intervention has grown progressively less and less tenable until it has now become repugnant to a growing body of those educated in the sciences. The advance of knowledge makes the God hypothesis untenable to an increasing number of people. And Huxley was a naturalist. Now, that word naturalist carries a number of meanings. It's original, and one of its still current meanings is a student of nature. But in this lecture, I will be using it in the philosophical sense to describe a worldview. That is, a view of the world and human relationship to it in which only the operation of the natural, as opposed to the supernatural laws and forces, is admitted. It's a very old worldview. It goes back to the time of Democritus and Leucippus, the brilliant inventors of atomic theory, who had the idea that ultimate reality are simply the particles in empty space. And those are the two things we must use to explain everything. So all of life, consciousness, everything else must be irreducibly explicable bottom up in terms, essentially, as we would say, of mass energy. Now, of course, opposed to that, in the ancient world, there were the views of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who said, no, there's more to the world than this. There's something more. There are the gods, or there is God. There is transcendence. And what we face in the academy today is basically that. In my University of Oxford, there are the materialists or the naturalists, represented by Dawkins and people like that. And then there are many theists, in my case, Christian theists. And that's where the tension is. And so we need to address that today. But what do we mean when we say something is natural? Now, the best people I find to go to are the English majors. I'm a pure mathematician, and that is a very fortunate thing because I started off in life loving languages, and then I wanted to be an electrical engineer, and then I changed to pure mathematics. And so I wander in between the various fields, and I am still passionate both about natural languages on the one end of the spectrum and mathematics on the other end. The question of how we formulate meaning. And I'm very old, as you can see, and I just caught the tail end of C.S. Lewis at Cambridge. I heard his very last lectures on English. Now, Lewis defines natural for us in a very comprehensible way. He says, think of these sentences. Are those natural teeth or a set? 2, the dog in his natural state is covered with fleas. 3, I love to get away from the city and be alone with nature. And he points out that there's a common thread between those. The natural teeth are those which grow in the mouth. We don't have to design them or make them. The dog's natural state is the one he'll be in if no one takes soap and water and prevents it. The countryside, where nature reigns supreme, is the one where soil, weather, and vegetation produce their results unhelped and unimpeded by man. So, what is natural is that which goes on of its own accord, what you will get if you make no attempt to stop it. And Lewis concludes what the naturalist believes is that the ultimate fact, the thing you can't go behind, is a vast process in space and time which is going on of its own accord. So for the supernaturalist like me, nature is not the whole show. It is the creation of an intelligent God who's not part of it. Now, for the naturalist, the cosmos tends to be a closed system of cause and effect. It has no overarching purpose. It's not open to intervention from outside since there isn't any outside. Now, that does not mean that no naturalist believes in superintelligence. Many do. Paul Davies, for instance, who's a brilliant physicist, thinks there's vast intelligence out there. This universe shows evidence of it. But if you ask him what that intelligence is, he will say, well, it has come about from the basic stuff of the universe, just like our intelligence. That is, it's super intelligent beyond us, but it's not supernatural. So we must make that distinction. The contention then, with many of my colleagues at the Academy, is nature is everything. The cosmos, as Carl Sagan put it in his famous TV series, is all there is, was, or ever shall be. That's it. And therefore, miracles, particularly of the sort that are central to Christianity, for instance, the claim that Jesus rose physically from the dead, are simply impossible. Death is the final and permanent extinction of the person. Now, Richard Dawkins makes very clear that the gods he rejects are the supernatural gods. An atheist, he writes, in the sense of philosophical naturalist, is somebody who believes. Please notice the word belief, ladies and gentlemen. Dawkins is a man of faith. There is a widespread impression today that faith is a religious word, and it means believing where there's no evidence. That is doubly and dangerously false. All of us in this room are believers in something. We all have a worldview. This is Dawkins' worldview. This is what he believes. The next question is, what evidence is there for it? But what he believes is there's nothing beyond the natural physical world, no supernatural creative intelligence lurking behind the observable universe. The result of that is, and I suppose it's been formulated most strongly by Stephen Hawking, arguably the most famous living scientist, the physicist in a wheelchair with Lou Gehrig's disease. He left it open for quite a while as to whether he believed in God or not. But now he's very clear that you and I must choose between science and God. If we want to be taken as intellectually credible people in the contemporary society, in Texas A&M, for instance, we must give up these childish notions of God, because God and science are mutually exclusive. Now, it can't be that simple. If you look at the Nobel Prize winners between 1900 and 2000, you might be surprised to know that over 60% of them were believers. And perhaps the tally is highest for physicists. And one thing I want to clear up right at the start this evening is this. The idea that science and religion are mutually opposed is a myth. It's a complete myth. And that ought to be obvious to every one of you. Take, for example, the Nobel Prize for Physics. You have a winner of it. You may have one here. There's certainly one in Austin, Professor Steven Weinberg. He's an atheist. Another American who won it more recently than Steven Weinberg is William Phillips. He's a Christian. Now, what does that tell you? You see, what divides those two men is not their physics. They've both won the Nobel Prize. They're brilliant. They're geniuses. But what divides them is their worldview. One's an atheist, the other's a theist. And what I want to suggest to you is, if you want to navigate around the debate that's going on in the academy today, is to get out of your head that it's science versus God. It's not. It's a conflict between two worldviews. Atheism on the one hand, theism on the other hand, and there are scientists on both sides. So the real question to ask is, what way does science point? Now, we'll be looking at as we go down a little bit. But you will find Nobel Prize winners and leading scientists in our country who not only believe in God, but they believe in the supernatural. They believe that Jesus Christ, for instance, literally rose from the dead, and they're not embarrassed about it. They believe it to be a fact of history. So they clearly don't think that it's irrational to believe in the supernatural. That is, they don't think that science demands naturalism. You see, the impression people get is, if you're a scientist, you've got to be an atheist, you've got to be a naturalist. But if you listen carefully to some of the leading scientists, you find a different story. For instance, George Klein won the Nobel Prize in immunology. And he said, I'm not an agnostic, I'm an atheist. My attitude is not based on science, but rather on faith. Now here's blind faith coming. The absence of a creator, the non-existence of God is my childhood faith, my adult belief, unshakable and holy. Do you notice what he's saying? It's very honest. He's saying my atheism has nothing to do with my science. I'm an atheist before I'm a scientist. Now, Richard Lewontin is a world-famous geneticist at Harvard. And he reviewed Carl Sagan's last book. And he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Now listen to this carefully. This is one of the world's leading geneticists honestly writing what he believes. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It's not that science compels us to accept material explanations. No, no. On the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And he goes on to say, that materialism is absolute. Why? For we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's honest. He's saying, I start as a materialist. I shape my science so that it will only produce materialistic results. Now, that's a statement of his belief. And here's a very important principle that I hope you've already been taught at this university. Statements by scientists are not always statements of science. Can I say that again? Statements by scientists are not always statements of science. But the problem is, science, quite rightly in a sense, has enormous cultural authority in the Western world today. So people think if a scientist says, for instance, Sagan, the cosmos is all that is, was, or ever shall be, they think that's a statement of science. It's not. It's simply a statement of his atheistic credo. That's all. So it's very important. Richard Feynman was a brilliant Nobel Prize-winning physicist in California, and he brought things right down to earth when he says, outside of science, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And there's a lot of sense in that. You must learn, all of you, in the humanities as well, to ask questions and don't assume that because a person has an authority, that therefore everything they are saying is either true or scientific. So the choice isn't between science and God, it's between belief systems. And therefore we need to have a look at this. Now, I want very briefly to pick up again this notion of faith, because a lot of the confusion comes from not understanding what we mean by faith. I'm often asked to give lectures on science and faith. I never will, because that is an atheistic formulation. You have science on the one side, and what do you mean by faith? Well, most people mean religion. But unfortunately, in English, faith has two meanings. It means religious faith, the Christian faith, the Jewish faith. But it also means the subjective response, trust. Faith is from the Latin fides. And the trouble is, well, there are several troubles. First of all, the Mark Twain definition has got the ascendancy. You know Mark Twain's definition of faith. Believing what you know ain't true. Now, many people, including Dawkins, think that. To such an extent, they write nonsense. Christopher Hitchens wrote in one of his books, our faith is not a faith, our beliefs are not a belief. Because he was struggling with this, he felt that what he believed is based on evidence, but faith isn't based on evidence. Now, this leads to huge confusion. So let's sort it out. Faith, fides, trust, loyalty, you know exactly what it means. Do you have faith in your home football team? The next question is why? You can ask for evidence. Every one of us knows what evidence-based faith means. You know why you trust your friends, why you trust some of your professors, and so on and so forth. You know you need evidence. And if you want to know what evidence-based faith is, go and try and get a loan from a bank manager. He wants evidence so that he can trust you on its basis. Now, I can only speak here as a Christian. And we need to make it very clear. Other religions have the right and should defend themselves in this. But as a Christian, I want to make very clear that the Christian faith is evidence-based. It's not blind faith. The Apostle John, writing on the big issues, said Jesus did many other signs. These are the miracles. We'll come to them in a moment. Did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence upon which faith is based. So that's what I'm committed to. Christianity, my faith in God and Christ is based on evidence. Otherwise, it wouldn't sit here for a microsecond. So that's the first side of it. The other side of it is this, that when Dawkins says a thing like this, atheists have no faith, he's talking nonsense, strictly. But what that obscures is that science is faith-based. It's not science and faith. I often say to people, you want a lecture in science and faith, do you want me to mention God? Oh, yes, please. Well, I said, God isn't in the title, and I can give you a lecture in science and faith without mentioning God. How's that? Because faith is essential to every academic discipline. Have you thought about it? Let me tell you what Einstein said about it, in case you don't believe me. Einstein said once, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. Now, he didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational or the mathematical intelligibility of the universe. You've got to believe that science can be done before you do it. If you didn't believe it could be done, you wouldn't do it. You've got to have a basic commitment before you start. And I was taught quantum mechanics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, who's very well known, and he constantly emphasizes in his books that physics is powerless to explain its faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe, for the simple reason that you've got to believe that before you do any physics at all. So this idea of science here and faith there is completely wrong in many different directions. And so this is a very important element in the whole thing. Faith is essential to science. But now that leads to very interesting things. Remember what our title is. You've probably forgotten already. Is it irrational to believe in the supernatural? Let's explore that a little bit. Paul Davies, who's a physicist, not a theist, very well known. He's at ASU across the road there. Science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. He points out that even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith the existence of a law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. Okay. So in order to do science, engineering, anything really, you have to trust. Now, what do we do science with? I suppose Socrates is one of my intellectual heroes. He asks questions all the time. I've discovered in life it's much easier to ask questions than answer them. So I spend a lot of time playing Socrates, and it can be real fun. Let me give you an example of it. Here I am talking to an eminent scientist, and I say, what do you do science with? Oh, he said, I've got this billion-dollar machine. Don't mean that machine. I mean, oh, he said, ha, you mean mind? And he's about to say mind when he remembers there's no such thing as the mind. There's only the brain. So I say, okay, you do science with your brain. I do actually believe there is a mind, but that's too long a story. So we'll accept that you do science with your brain. Okay, tell me about this thing you do science with, your brain. Sure. Tell me, what's the story of the brain? Do you want the long story or the short story? Short story, please. Well, in the end, really, I suppose it comes down to this. He says, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. So I look at him and I smile and I say, and you trust it? Tell me, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Not for a split second. Isn't this odd now? You see, that's the materialistic explanation of the brain, put very crudely, of course. But that's it. There's no ultimate meaning, so the thing we're doing science with is not something we can trust. Now, this is a very important argument. It's moved into the center of this whole discussion because it's not only people like me who you'd expect to use it. Atheists are now using it. And I want you to listen carefully to this, because that doubt about the reliability of the human mind, you know who it started with? Charles Darwin. That might surprise you. Let me read to you what Darwin said. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And he goes on to say, what would you think of the convictions of a monkey's mind? Would you trust them even if there were any convictions in such a mind? Now, Alvin Plantinga is one of the world's leading philosophers. He's a Christian. He was at the University of Notre Dame until recently. And he upgrades this. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief they produce including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. His biology, now listen to this is very interesting. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Now Thomas Nagel comes into the picture. Thomas Nagel is what I call a hard atheist. He's a brilliant philosopher in New York. He says he doesn't want there to be a God, so it's very clear what he holds. But on this topic, he says, the establishment today is devoted beyond all reason to a dominant scientific naturalism, heavily dependent on Darwinian explanations of practically everything, and armed to the teeth against attacks from religion. The priority given to evolutionary naturalism in the face of its implausible conclusions is due, I think, to the secular consensus that this is the only form of external understanding of ourselves that provides an alternative to theism. Reductionist materialism, that is reducing everything to physics and chemistry, doesn't account for the brute facts of existence. It doesn't explain, for instance, why the world exists at all or how life arose from non-life. It doesn't begin to explain our fundamental beliefs and so on. These failures are not temporary gaps in our knowledge. It's simply that materialism as a philosophy cannot account for brute facts. And he goes on to make a very interesting statement. He said, if the mental is not merely physical, which the reductionist materialist believes, everything is reducible to physics and chemistry, then it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which that naturalism depends. Consciousness is the most conspicuous obstacle to a comprehensive naturalism that relies only on the resources of physical science. If we take this problem seriously and follow out its implications, it threatens to unravel the entire naturalistic world picture. And years ago, Lewis saw this. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court. Now listen to Friedrich Nietzsche, who's had a huge influence on secular thinking. He says this, only if we assume a God who is morally our like can truth and the search for truth be at all something meaningful and promising of success. Now, here's what I'm going to suggest to you. The question before us is belief in the supernatural irrational? I'm going to suggest that it's belief in the purely natural that's irrational. In other words, I'm going to suggest that my biggest reason for not being an atheist is not because I'm a Christian, but because I'm a scientist. And I cannot accept as valid an argument that destroys the validity of my own thinking. It's serious to shoot yourself in the foot. That's very painful. Don't do it. But shooting yourself in the brain is fatal. And that, it seems to me, exactly what's happening if you follow atheistic materialism to its logical conclusion. Now, that may surprise many of you, because many people have the impression that Christians are on the defensive. It's the exact opposite, ladies and gentlemen. The exact opposite. And what is more, here we live, and here is the supreme irony. We live in the information age, and that's an exciting age to live in. One of the fundamental concepts of science is now information, and people are trying very hard to reduce it to physics and chemistry, and they're failing because they've realized that although information is normally carried on something physical, like the DNA code in the human genome, information itself is not physical, it's not even material. And here's the irony of the 21st century scientist, that one of the fundamental things that's fascinating all of us is not material. That's the end of materialism as a philosophy, actually. And the attempt to reduce physics and, to reduce language to material doesn't work. Now, this is very important. I said that I was very keen on languages. I am. You see, we're often taught that explanation in science means explaining the complex in terms of the simple. Now, that often works, and it's usually put forward as a universal paradigm, but unfortunately, it doesn't work everywhere. The place it doesn't work is language. The moment you see something written, look up at the screen. You just look at one of those words there, and you know whatever automatic, natural, unguided processes are involved in putting that up on the wall, there's a mind behind it. Why? Because you see evidence of semiotics up there. You see signs that convey meaning because you've learned English independently of what you see up there. That's crucially important because, as I often say to people, look, you recognize somebody draws your name in the sand on the seashore, 4 or 5 letters of your name. You recognize instantly that somebody's been there. There's a mind behind it. And I often say to scientists who are studying DNA, hey, you've got an interesting word there in the human genome. It's, how long is it? 3.5 billion letters? Exactly in the right order. Tell me about it. What's its ultimate origin? Obviously, it involves all kinds of natural processes, but what is its origin? And they say, without blinking an eyelid, chance and necessity. Chance and the laws of nature? I say, well, just a moment, what's going on here? You see a 5-letter word, and you immediately postulate mind. You see a 3.5 billion letter word, and you say chance and the laws of nature. That's very odd, ladies and gentlemen, and it doesn't make any sense, actually. That conclusion is reached because materialism is a dominant philosophy, because the answer has to be naturalistic. There's no alternative if you believe in naturalism. Now, I want to make 1 or 2 more points, and they're simple points, but they're very important points. The first of them is that the idea that science and God are opposed is historically false. You see, modern science arose with pioneer people like, well, Galileo, Kepler, Newton. They were all believers in God. And historians and philosophers of science have long studied that and said, is there a connection? There is a connection, a very powerful connection. Modern science arose because people were driven to study the natural world because they believed there was an intelligent creator behind it. To quote Lewis again, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And so, far from science and God being opposed, belief in God was the motor that drove science. So how do we get from Newton, who believes in God and science, to Stephen Hawking, who says we must choose? I think it is huge confusion about the nature of scientific explanation. Asking people to choose between science and God is like asking them to choose between Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. That's just crazy. We know that 2 explanations of different kinds are necessary. Henry Ford is the intelligent agent that conceived the motor car. He doesn't conflict with the explanation in terms of automobile engineering and laws of internal combustion. You need both. And sometimes I say to students, so I'll say it tonight, why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat energy is being conducted through the copper kettle base. It's agitating the molecules of water. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I'd love a cup of tea. Now, let me put it to you. Do those explanations conflict or compete? No. But they're totally different kinds of explanation. And incidentally, which is the more important one? Well, it's me wanting a cup of tea. People have been making tea for thousands of years before they understand anything about heat equations. Do you see that? The scientific explanation is limited. Now, here's the big, big problem. When someone says to us, science explains, we think that's a full explanation, don't we? It almost never is. I was taught the law of gravity at school. I was taught that it explained gravity. I was in my middle age before I discovered it does no such thing. Nobody knows what gravity is, even today. Wittgenstein put it this way. He said, the great deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not, they're descriptions. They're very powerful and useful descriptions. So the irony is when we hear science explains, that tends to be very limited, even within science. Explanation is bigger than science. That's why science is successful. It asks limited questions. It tends to deal with the how rather than the why. It doesn't cope with questions of meaning, and so on. So faced with all of this, I would want to suggest to you that one of the reasons, it's not the only one, there are many others, that Stephen Hawking says you must choose between science and God is there's a profound misunderstanding on those different levels of explanation. The God explanation is not the same as the science explanation. It doesn't compete with it, it doesn't conflict with it. God is the answer to the question, why is the universe at all? That works according to these principles. Now, you may want to raise questions of that, because I want to come on now to the great objection that comes to all of this. And it's the great objection, I'll deal with two objections, that this is all very well, but we now know the laws of nature, and they're inviolable. David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, says that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. You've all heard this. And since we know the laws now, it's impossible to believe in miracles. End of story, end of Christianity, and so on. Well, David Hume was wrong. Now that sounds like a very arrogant statement, but I happened to get to know Anthony Flew, who was the world's leading expert on dealing with Hume's philosophy, and was the Richard Dawkins of his age. And he told me in high upper age, Flew had come to believe in God. And he said Hume was wrong, and I would have to write all my books again, but I'll never be able to. But the argument why he was wrong is very easy to see. I'm staying in a hotel, very pleasant hotel, by the way. I can recommend it, but I mustn't mention its name. Here in College Station. So the first night I came here, I put $100 in the drawer. The second night, I put another $100. That's how many dollars? $200. The third morning, I found $50. Now tell me, what's been broken? The laws of arithmetic or the laws of Texas? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's the laws of Texas. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, the problem in understanding this question of miracle is a confusion of two different uses of the word law. The interesting thing is, I thought, mistakenly, that the drawer was a closed system of cause and effect. But it wasn't. It's an open system. So a thief can put their hand in, and I know that the thief has put their hand in. It wasn't my wife, you see. The thief has put their hand in because I know the laws of arithmetic. Now, extrapolate that up to the size of the problem. The Christian claim is not that Jesus Christ rose from the dead by natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before it happened, but that he was raised from the dead by a God who's outside the system. Science has nothing to say to that. It didn't break any laws whatsoever. You see, the miracles of the New Testament don't break laws. Laws are descriptions of what normally happens, but they don't hold God prisoner. Indeed, now here's the irony. Hume said another thing that was very silly. He said it was easy to believe in miracles 20 centuries ago because people didn't know the laws of nature. That's nonsense. You know, Joseph, who was engaged to Mary, knew exactly where babies come from. And when his wife was pregnant, he didn't believe her story. He wanted to divorce her. Why was that? Because he was primitive and pre-scientific? No, because he knew exactly what the gynecological facts were. And so he wouldn't accept her until he had a special supernatural visitation from God. And so it goes on. Here's the irony, you see. You cannot recognize a miracle unless you know the normal laws to which nature operates. The mistake is in thinking they're like the laws of Texas. They're not. They're simply descriptions of what normally happens. And therefore, to determine whether a miracle has happened at any level, like the resurrection of Jesus, you now have to, because you'd be crazy to believe every claim to miracle, of course you would, you have to then investigate the evidence for that particular occurrence. But science has not rendered belief in miracles impossible. But remember what I'm saying. You get to the supernatural long before you get to the miracles of the Bible. Because human rationality is your first evidence of the supernatural. Because what I've been arguing tonight is, if you hold that your rationality is natural, you've no reason to trust it for anything. Isn't this an interesting thing? God has put a kind of outpost of supernaturalness into every one of you. And the only grounds for trusting it, I pointed out that the atheist ultimately has no logical grounds for trusting it, although they do, of course. But the Christian who believes in God has every reason for trusting it, because I would argue that the reason I can understand part of the universe out there is because the same God created both the universe out there in my mind and here. So there's a perfect consistency. And that was the belief that lay behind the science you study in this university. Isn't it ironic that Stephen Hawking, who up until recently held Isaac Newton's chair at Cambridge, uses science as a reason for not believing in God? Now, I can go into a lot more detail on the flaws in the logic of his actual hard evidence, as he claims it is, but you may want to leave that for the questions. To sum up, there are two worldviews, they conflict. One starts in the beginning where the particles, mass, energy, or the favorite these days is nothing. The universe comes from nothing. Okay, you start with nothing, and you come up to a universe with minds in it. The other worldview starts with the mind of God. Do you see how diametrically opposed they are? It goes like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through Him. That's an existence statement. The Word is eternal. All things, that is mass, energy, the universe, you and me, are derivative. The atheistic worldview is the exact opposite. You start with nothing, or a quantum vacuum, or physics and chemistry, and you end up with you and me. And it's not simply as a Christian, but as a scientist, that I know which view makes most sense. Thank you very much indeed.
We have several excellent questions from Twitter, so I'll ask a few of those to get us started.
Jolly good.
All
By
right.
the way, this is a Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, so you're going to be very disappointed. And the reason you're going to be disappointed is I can just respond off the top of my head, and I bet you most of them will require an hour of an answer, which you won't get. But if you've come with one of these questions, the important stuff is not what I say. It's the work you do afterwards to get a satisfactory answer to your question. So it's worth doing anyway. So proceed, McDuff.
All right. So you mentioned that information can't be simply the same as the physical vector that carries it. So a very common response is kind of expressed in this question. Isn't information simply an emergent property of the configuration of the physical vector that carries it? An emergent property?
Yes, the word emergent covers a vast multitude of sins. It's one of these non-words. And I say to people, well, I put Dawkins onto this. He was talking about emergent properties like this. It was actually in this context. So I said to him, please, this was the first time I'd encountered him. I said, give me an example of an emergent property. Well, he said, this dates me, of course, the ability of a computer to do word processing. And I just said to him, but that's an example of an intelligent designed use. It doesn't just emerge. You see, you have to ask a whole series of questions. How does it emerge? Does it emerge naturally? Does it emerge with a catalyst? Does it emerge with the application of heat? Does it require energy, or does it require information? Now, in Dawkins' example, it requires a lot of intelligent input into the system to turn, well, you don't know any computers that weren't word processors. That just shows you that I lived a long time ago. But that's the kind of thing. But to say it's an emergent property tells me zero, unless you've got a mechanism by which information can be generated by physics and chemistry, and nobody's done anything like that. You see, when Miller and Urey won the Nobel Prize in 1953, they thought they'd discovered the secret of life because they got some of the basic constituents, the amino acids, through discharging a lightning-like discharge in a retort tube in a laboratory. That's 1953. And the experts, and I've talked to them at the origin of life research, they're no further on. Because, of course, what they didn't realize was that the whole problem is not getting the building blocks, although that's very difficult. It's getting everything in the right order, so that you've got 3.5 billion letters in the right order. And that kind of stuff doesn't come about because the physics and chemistry don't have the power to do that. You see, the whole point about the four-letter genetic alphabet is that you can place these things anywhere down the genome. If you had physics and chemistry constraining where they should be placed, you empty everything as meaning. You know, in English, Q is always followed by U. If that were true of every set of letters, you couldn't express anything. There's a vast literature in this, but it's the attempt to get word from non-word is getting harder. And that's exactly what I would expect if we're asking the wrong questions. You see, I'm happy for people to make that attempt, but it's like, let me give you another analogy, because information comes under the laws of thermodynamics. Have you all heard of a perpetual motion machine? Well, I used to get long papers. Dear sir, here's the plan for a perpetual motion machine. 100 pages of argument, figures, formulae. Do you know what I did with it? What did I do with it? I threw it in the waste paper basket. Now, would you say to me, oh, but that's obscurantist. How do you know he didn't do it? I know because there's a law of conservation of energy, that there's going to be a flaw there. Now, Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, suggested that there may well be a law of conservation of information. In other words, natural processes are good for transmitting information, but not for generating it. And if you go into theoretical computer science and the work of people like Gregory Chaitin of Bell Labs and Olaf Kuppers in Germany, you will discover various fascinating theorems. And they go something like this, that any machine which can be simulated by a Turing machine, you probably know what a Turing machine is, some of you. Any computer can be simulated by a Turing machine. Turing machines cannot produce any information that aren't either in their input or in their structure. Now, that seems to me to be a pointer, a very strong pointer against any materialistic solution to this. Now, these are highly fascinating things. The nature of information is very difficult, but certainly I don't feel that that adds anything in the right direction.
Okay. I have a question you might not have gotten before. This is a really interesting one. Does mathematics affect your understanding of faith? Can you give an example of a way mathematics has deepened your faith?
Faith in what?
Oh, good question. It's a
Faith
tweet.
in God.
They only have 140 characters. They didn't. Faith in God, faith in Christianity.
The tweet uses the word faith on its own. You've got to add in God or in science or in what? How does mathematics help? Well, it helps in the way that I hinted at, that mathematics is probably the most precise language that's known. The fact that the universe can be described in that way, at least part of it, is stunning. Einstein was clever enough to notice it. So was Eugen Wigner, who also won the Nobel Prize. And he wrote a paper in 1961 called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Unreasonable. Why could someone, here she's sitting thinking in here about the universe, he comes up with an equation, and lo and behold, that's the way the universe works. How does that work? He says it's unreasonable. I add, and I say, yes, it is if you're a materialist, but not if you're a Christian. It's perfectly reasonable. So the fact that I can do mathematics is the basic thing here. But at another level, mathematics does push you hard to think logically, because it's publish or perish, of course, in most of the world. And in mathematics, you can't publish anything unless you can demonstrate it's absolutely right, which means that mathematicians often write a lot less than other people. And therefore, that rigor of logic is extremely helpful. But not only that, C.S. Lewis, you see, coming over to the humanities side, he wasn't a good mathematician. In fact, the world nearly didn't have C.S. Lewis because of the maths exam at Oxford, which he failed. And he wrote later, everywhere you go in life, the lion mathematics is lying in wait for you, you know? But he was a good geometer. And he used geometry in many of his books to illustrate some of the deeper sides of Christian thinking, you know, the Trinity and so on. So there are uses for mathematics. I wouldn't place them too highly, but I've enjoyed being a mathematician.
Here's a related question, and it's difficult to be eloquent in a tweet, but I thought this was a fairly eloquent tweet. What role does aesthetics, our perception of beauty in the world, play in validating the existence of the transcendental?
It is an important question, that. I think it was Paul Dirac, the brilliant quantum mathematician who was at Cambridge, said, if a theory is true, it will be beautiful. And our capacity to perceive beauty is part of our humanity. And we've restricted ourselves to the sort of factuality of science, but there's a big wider world up there that science doesn't deal with. It doesn't deal with aesthetics. Now, we are, I believe, beings made in the image of God, and beauty is a very important part of that, the perception of beauty. And it has led people, of course, for centuries. They look at the heavens. The heavens declare the glory of God. It's very hard to stand out under a southern Texan sky at night, miles from anywhere, and see the Milky Way and not have feelings of, surely there's more to it than this. And I think that beauty is set in us as part of what it means to be human, and therefore a side of our character to be developed, and therefore a pointer to the beauty of God, so to speak. It would be awfully boring if God was simply a scientist, because the bigger things in life, like aesthetics, like love, and so on and so forth. But there is a problem, of course, that may well be pointed out further down. But the world isn't all beauty, is it? I talk about a mixed world that's beauty and bombs. And you have to face that too. But I do think the questioner's in the right area, and aesthetics is a very important part of our life. Indeed, in the Genesis story, which is foundational, whatever you make of it, it's foundational. It says God made the trees good to look upon. That is by human beings. God is interested in our aesthetic response. That's why we like flowers about the place, and nice meals that are not looking like pigs will, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think that's as much as I'll say on that. I'll try to be shorter.
Sure. This is a really good question. I've gone off Twitter now. I'm on index cards.
I should have said that aesthetics plays such a role in my life, because in my first day at Cambridge, I had a vision. She was 16. And I've been married to her for 47 years. So that wasn't bad, was it? No, sorry about that.
I'm there with you. Lawrence Krauss says he'll believe in God if God forms a message by manipulating the clouds. Why does God not reveal himself in this way? And more generally, why doesn't the supernatural make itself more obvious?
I have had several interesting conversations with the Lawrence Krauss. I'm not so sure that he would believe it. You see, what we've been talking about tonight, miracle and the supernatural, draws attention to itself by being rare. And that actually is quite important. The central claim of Christianity is that Jesus is God incarnate. Now, that's very difficult for people to grasp, but the leading evidence of it is that he rose from the dead. Now, what bothers me about people like Krauss is they think that some configuration in the clouds will prove something, but they tend to refuse to examine the masses of evidence we've got for the much bigger things in history. And I'm not saying that wildly. I asked Dawkins privately once, did he discuss the resurrection with people? And he replied by saying, I don't know why anybody would ever be interested in it, which strikes me as a most anti-intellectual viewpoint. If death has been conquered, I want to know about it. And I'm not convinced that Christ would believe if there was a curious configuration of the clouds. You see, the interesting thing is, Christianity has not simply got an intellectual, but a moral dimension. And manipulations of clouds are all very well, but they're arbitrary. If you look at the signs, the semeion, from which we get semiotics, in the New Testament that Jesus did, they all have purpose, they all have a point, they all lead further down into helping us understand who he was and what he did. Now, when I find people that say they want evidence, but at the same time, they won't even read the New Testament, I just find that intellectually dishonest, full stop. They're not actually interested in evidence. Now, you say, is it happening today? Well, of course it is. You see, here's another thing that is thrown to me recently quite a lot. People say to me, look, you're supposed to be a scientist, but it's obvious you're not, because you're a Christian. And in science, things are testable. And here you are hung up in this religious stuff and it's not testable. Well, who told you that? Of course it's testable. Of course it's testable. Listen, you talking about supernature. I was watching TV at home just 2 weeks ago on a Sunday, and there was a man who'd been hung up very seriously narcotic dependent. And it was a Sunday show, and they were discussing a house where people like that who'd been given up by everybody else were taken in by a group of Christians. And the interviewer said, what does that house mean to you? He said, I went through that door and my life was saved. Completely put back together, and he said, now I'm helping drug addicts and so on. And the reporter said, what did it? And all he said was Jesus. Now, people formulate that in different ways, but ladies and gentlemen, I have watched all my life. The reason I'm sitting here, and I'm going to explain it now, is I have spent my entire life since childhood exposing my faith in God and Christ to its opposites, all over the world, but particularly in the Marxist world, where atheism is really pushed onto the people. Now, what I've observed is this. When you meet people, and their lives are in a mess. I was at UPenn not long ago, a huge crowd, 2,500 people or something. And a young Chinese student stood up on the balcony when I just finished a session like this, and he shouted down, he said, look at me. And everybody stopped and they all looked at him, and so did I. And I said, why should I look at you? He said, just look at me. And he stood there and his face was radiant like the sun. And then he said, a few months ago, I heard you talk in Sanford. He said, my life was in a complete mess. I was thinking of giving up everything. And he said, I listened that night, I went away, I thought about it, and I became a Christian. Just look at me, he said, I'm utterly transformed. And that happens again and again. You've heard of West Point? Yes? I see some military people here. Nice to see you. You know about West Point, don't you? I went to West Point twice in the past 2 years. After the first visit, I got a letter. Dear sir, the night before you came, I gave up the Christian faith. It wasn't intellectually credible. and I wouldn't dare anymore hold up my head. But something that was said, he said, completely changed my life. Now, I've watched and seen people come from despair, come from near suicide, come from narcotic dependence, come from lives full of meaninglessness, and they're transformed. And it's supernatural, I tell you. It is supernatural when you see that happen. Jesus Christ makes a claim that you can test. And it's that if we are prepared to face the mess we've made of life and prepared to make a deliberate step of trust and commitment to him, he'll give us peace with God. He'll give us new life and new power. You can test that. And I know, because I'm young at heart still, that one of the biggest things we need in life is meaning, forgiveness, healing of relationships, all that kind of thing. I watch it happen again and again and again. So I don't need to be convinced that God is working and real and supernatural today. It's the manipulation of the clouds that I wouldn't find impressive. But I often say to audiences, they say, look, if you don't believe this stuff, we'll meet here in 1 year's time. I'll bring 500 people whose lives have been transformed by Christianity. You bring 500 whose lives have been transformed for atheism, and then we'll talk. So that would be my initial reaction to that.
Great.
So you mentioned earlier how if the brain came about through purely naturalistic means, that undermines our confidence in human cognitive reliability. But couldn't one say the brain is reliable because it was formed over a long time using natural selection, and that natural selection would tend to give us true beliefs?
Well, certainly one could say it, because you've just done so. But this idea that natural selection will give us true beliefs, this is ridiculed by leading atheist philosophers. Natural selection is interested in survival, not in truth. And John Gray would be the main person to read on that. I mean, that's just spinning words. You see, people sometimes complain of me believing in a God of the gaps. You know, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But there's a sort of evolution of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore evolution did it. But unless you say how it happened, you're not adding anything to the content. And this is what I call a just so story. Couldn't it have been? Well, tell me how it could have been. Tell me how this kind of thing happens. And nobody has the least idea when you ask the experts who are trying 24 hours a day almost to do it.
We have a number of questions that generally circle around the problem of evil. And I know that can be formulated in a very philosophical way, or it can be asked in a more personal way. And I think this person may be in the second category. If there's a superior being in control, why do tragic things happen in the world?
That's a hard question. In fact, it's the hardest question for any of us. And often, almost inevitably, that question comes up in multiple forms. Indeed, coming to North America, I've noticed about 3 out of 5 invitations have wanted me to face this question. And it's the beauty in barbed wire again, you see. I'll try to be very brief. How long have we got? Because this is a huge...
Got about 12 minutes, and I have at least one more question.
Okay, well, do you want me to try and say something about this? You'd like me to, okay, because it's not directly on the topic, but indirectly it is. Well, let me go this way. First of all, there are 2 sources of pain and evil. The one is the bad things people do to each other. And the other is what we call natural evil, or pain, tsunamis, cancers, all that kind of thing. Secondly, there are 2 perspectives. An oncologist, a professor of cancer, looks at cancer a different way from a young woman who's just been told she's 3 months to live. There's the inside story, and there's the observer story. Now, in an audience like this, we'll be mixed. There's some of you really hurting. There's some of you have illnesses. There's some of you have relatives who are dying, and so on. So you're inside the pain. You're hurting. There are others who are interested in how one copes with these questions, quite understandably. And therefore, there's a huge pastoral side to this. And I want to be sensitive, because I know in an audience this size, there are people for whom this is a huge existential question, a really huge one. How do we approach it? Well, let's take the intellectual side very briefly. I sympathize greatly, and I have many friends who say, well, it's wonderful to talk about science and God, and perhaps there's evidence of an intelligence, but don't talk to me about a God of love and power and so on, because you're insulting me. I couldn't believe in that. And they become atheists. And I understand that. I have loads of friends in that position. But just follow me for a moment. Atheism appears to be a solution in that it treats the pain and the suffering as brute fact. That's just how it is. Dawkins is the classic example of this, where he says, the universe is just like we'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now that's a grim view, because that means the shooters at various schools around the States who shoot their classmates and teachers are just dancing to the music of their DNA. That's the end of morality, which Dawkins says it is. There is no good, no evil. But then why is he talking about the problem of evil if he doesn't believe evil exists? There's a double think here. And Dostoevsky was the man who really put his finger on it when he said, "Jestli Boga niet to всё позволен." And the Russian speakers will know that that means if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Dostoevsky wasn't saying that atheists can't be moral. Of course they can. From where I sit, everybody, no matter what they believe, is made in the image of God as a moral being. What Dostoevsky was saying, ultimately, there's no logical justification for morality if God doesn't exist. So the atheist solution actually leads to a negation of the problem of evil. But they still want to maintain there is a problem of evil. So there's a huge problem in there. Now come to the other side. And the other side is this, that the argument, and it goes back to David Hume as well. I don't know whether any of the questioners quoted him. And back to Epicurus, the famous Latin poet, saying, God, you can't have a good God and an all-powerful God and evil. You can't have those three things existing simultaneously because they contradict each other. And I remember as a student, we used to sit up half the night saying, well, surely a good God could, would, should, might. Do you remember those kind of arguments? Have you ever got through that argument satisfactorily? No. Now, being a mathematician is helpful here, because when you try answering a question and you can get nowhere, it's best to start asking another question if you're getting nowhere. And here's my other question for you to think about. We get nowhere. Why do we get nowhere? Because this world presents us with a mixed picture of beauty and barbed wire. You watch your television tonight, and you see that. Beauty and barbed wire. And in fact, the vast majority of people who've ever lived, it's mostly barbed wire and not beauty. We are in this room immensely privileged to have enough food, clothing, and all the rest of it. Immensely and unbelievably privileged. But for the vast majority of people, there's beauty and barbed wire. Yes? Not only that, the vast majority, if atheism is true, the vast majority of people who have ever lived will never get justice by definition. They didn't get it in this world, and there's no other world for them to get it in. Now, Dawkins once said to me, that's bleak, but that doesn't mean it's false. I said, no, it's bleak, but it doesn't mean it's true either. We need to go deeper than this, Richard, because this is such a serious question. Atheism destroys ultimate justice. Now, to be fair to Richard Dawkins, when I said that, he said, but I believe in working for justice in this world. I said, so do I, Richard. Let's do as much as we can. But the fact is, the vast proportion of the multi-millions of people who've ever lived will never get justice, if you're right. So here's my question. Granted that we're faced with beauty and barbed wire, a mixed picture, even within ourselves often. Here's the question. Is there anywhere enough evidence that there's a God exists who we could trust with it? That's a tough question, ladies and gentlemen. Is there anywhere any evidence that there is a God that we could trust with it, and I believe there is. This isn't a simplistic solution, but it's a way in, it's a window. You see, at the heart of Christianity, I've talked about the resurrection, but the resurrection was preceded by the cross. Now, come with me. Many of you may not believe this stuff, but listen, if you want to understand a worldview, you must listen to what it says before you write it off. So let's listen just for a moment. The claim is that the man on the cross was actually the God that invented human beings and invented the universe, invented light, gravity, and everything else. That's a staggering claim. Suppose for a moment it's true. What's God doing on a cross? Well, it shows something, doesn't it? It shows that God has not remained distant from our suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there's a resurrection. Death isn't the end. And when the early Christians went out, the first Veritas forum was at Athens University in about 35 AD. And Paul said to those Athenians, half of them were materialists and half of them were people who believed in fate, stoical fate. And he said to them, you know, God has appointed a day in which he's going to judge the world by that man whom he raised from the dead. It's evidence for everybody. In other words, he was saying there's going to be a final judgment. That's a fantastically wonderful thing. That our sense of morality is not a joke. It's not an illusion. It's not a delusion. There's a backup. There is an absolute morality, and there will be a final judgment. So justice will be done. And if you've ever stood in Auschwitz, you'll be very grateful, as I've done many times, that justice will be done. How God is going to work it through Christ is beyond me, but that is a claim, and I believe it to be true. But now people start to get leery. They want God to step in and stop the evil. But what about the evil in here, in me? I don't want God to mess with that. And here's the wonder of the Christian message. Now, hear me very carefully. Christianity at this point competes with no other religion, for the simple reason that no other religion or philosophy offers me what Christ offers me. There's no competition because there's nobody else that does this. And what does he offer me? He tells me now that this death on the cross was not simply solidarity and suffering. It was, in some deep and mysterious way, a taking upon himself of the mess I've made of life. Sin, in other words. To be able to form a basis on which I could be forgiven and given new life. That means a great deal to me. He that hears my word, Jesus said, and believes on him that sent me shall not come into judgment. What a magnificent statement. But has eternal life, has already passed from death to life. That's either true or it's nonsense. And the question is for you tonight, as you consider the Christian worldview, that's the point of a Veritas forum, other people will come here, and rightly so. You need to hear lots of worldviews. I was exposed to them very young, all sorts of different worldviews. But what they have to say on this topic is utterly crucial. Because if Christ rose from the dead, ladies and gentlemen, death is not the end. And you cannot hope that everything you've done will simply be wiped out in an eternal tomb. This is a moral universe. And each of you wants to see justice done. If you don't believe that, you watch your reaction to somebody who accuses you of doing wrong when you didn't do it. You want justice to be done. The wonderful thing is that God has given us this hope of justice being done. That's part of the big story. It's a big enough story to live in. I find atheism so tiny. It gives me a tiny world, 70 years more or less, and I've reached the 70 years. That's all, and then nothing. But this is a huge meta-narrative, starting in eternity with the God who is eternal. This earth, a temporary planet. The scientists tell us that. But you are not a temporary phenomenon. Every one of you here will exist forever. And what a pity it would be to go to a university as wonderful as this and to miss getting to know the Creator. That's the biggest thing in life. Thank you very much.
With that, we're going to go ahead and close. Be sure to turn your survey cards into that back table. As we leave, let's give Dr. Lennox a Texas A&M thank you one last time.
Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.